N. Sreekumar is an assistant professor of philosophy in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. He is a gold medalist for MA Philosophy from the Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam. He did his MPhil and PhD in philosophy from the Central University of Hyderabad and specializes in the areas of philosophy of language, continental philosophy, and hermeneutics. He has been into the academic profession since 1995 and has taught in Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, Kerala and BITS Pilani, Rajasthan before joining the IIT Madras in 2003. Dr. Sreekumar has published articles in various journals and has presented papers in national and international seminars. Some of the courses he offers include European philosophy, contemporary German philosophy, Introduction to Indian philosophy, philosophical hermeneutics, philosophy and critical theory, and philosophy of language.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series in philosophy. Today our topic is Phenomenology and Existentialism. Phenomenology is one of the major philosophical movements that has taken place in 20th century in Western philosophy. So before entering into the main topics, we will have to place phenomenology and existentialism as philosophical movements in the context of the major philosophical discourse that has taken place in Western civilization. So let us see that now. Introduction. So in this lecture we will be covering the following topics. We will be seeing what is philosophy, the general nature of philosophy, and some of the basic assumptions which are relevant in philosophy. We will see the change in the basic assumptions of philosophy. This is essential to see the historical development in the conceptual history of Western tradition. We will again see the three major epochs in Western thought. This needs to be discussed because Western philosophy has undergone, according to some philosophers, three major changes, conceptual changes in its history. We will see in detail all these three epochs later. There is the importance of German philosophy, because basically phenomenology is a conceptual movement that has taken place in German philosophy. So we have to really place phenomenology and existentialism in the context of German philosophy. So we will have to see German philosophy briefly. So this is what we are planning to cover in today's lecture. We will see now what is philosophy. It is very difficult to give a very simple and definite and precise definition to philosophy, because philosophy has been defined by many people in many ways and many traditions. For example, in India we have a different concept of philosophy. The Western world subscribe to a totally different conception. So it is very difficult to have a very comprehensive definition which covers or which does justice to all aspects of what we call philosophy. But still, philosophy has been treated traditionally as a foundational discipline, a status which it has lost in 20th century and in the contemporary philosophical discussions. But still we can see that philosophy deals with problems an individual faces in her encounter with the world, with other humans and with herself. So in one sense it deals with problems which human beings face, or it tries to tackle the problems human beings face in their encounter with nature, with reality, with other human beings, and after all with themselves. We will now see some issues addressed by traditional philosophy, because this is also important. We will have to have a feel about what traditional philosophy is all about in the Western philosophical traditions. What is ultimate reality? This is one of the major questions raised by traditional thinkers in the Western philosophical traditions, particularly by the Greek thinkers in the pre-Socratic age. They raise the question, what is this ultimate reality? What is that reality which is at the foundation, which is at the basis of all that we see, we experience and we live? So this is one of the major questions addressed by philosophers. Now this is another question. This question whether reality is material or spiritual. This deals with the nature of reality. What is the real nature of reality? Whether it is material, as some materialists would say that there is nothing beyond, the world is made up of atoms or physical substances, there is nothing beyond this. And there are certain philosophers who would argue that this is not the whole story, because reality is basically spiritual. So we have to really place, or in our understanding of philosophy, we have to take into account all these various assumptions. Now this is another question, whether reality is something which is always under constant change, or whether there is something which can be called as essence, something which is permanent, change or permanence. This is another major philosophical question. Now yet another important philosophical issue is the relationship between mind and body. This problem has been very actively present in the history of philosophy ever since Plato has introduced the ultimate dichotomy between spirit and body, matter. But it acquired prominence in the 16th and 17th centuries, when modern philosophers took it up as a very important issue, particularly after Descartes, who has introduced the mind body problem at the center stage of philosophy. We will see the uses of philosophy, because this is also important. There are various explanations can be given, but the most prominent one is that wherever clear thinking and logical reasoning are needed, we are stepping into philosophy, because philosophy has this function of clarifying our thoughts. And in modern 20th century philosophy, where we understand philosophy as philosophy of language, there again one of the major functions attached to language is clarification of human thought, or language philosophy is considered, for example, by Wittgenstein as a critic of language, and language is nothing but an expression of human thinking. So this function of philosophy is very important, that wherever clear thinking and logical reasoning are needed, philosophy steps in to raise very important and relevant questions concerning life and existence. This is yet another important function or use of philosophy. It raises very fundamental, very basic questions about life, the meaning of human life, what is the ultimate human destiny, all such very important questions, or rather quote unquote problems of life, are raised and discussed by philosophers from time immemorial. So these are some of the basic uses of philosophy, and this is again to repeat, to understand and analyze problems we face in life, how the very concept of what is life, such basic questions like what is life, what is the meaning of life, are raised by philosophers. So these are some of the uses of philosophy. Now the next issue is again to understand reality and oneself. This is rather the ultimate use of philosophy, understand reality and oneself, again for conceptual clarity, an issue which we have already mentioned, and finally for liberation, moksha. For example, in Indian tradition, philosophy or darshana, we understand the major use of philosophy or darshana that it aids liberation or moksha. So these are the major uses of philosophy. Now we will cover some of the changing assumptions of philosophy. The very conception of philosophy has changed because of certain changes in history and culture. So the major one is the development of sciences, which was characteristic of 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. So this has changed the very nature and the very concept of philosophizing in the Western world. Reason acquired prominence during this age. So this has made philosophy a different language game altogether from traditional thought. Next is Renaissance and Enlightenment, which is related to the first one which we have already mentioned. This period, Renaissance and Enlightenment, or rather we can say the birth of modernity, is also the birth of reason or resurrection of reason. Reason has become the watchword, or that the most important, the vital category, analyzing, understanding and all that. So philosophy as a rational endeavor redefined and reasserted itself during this period with the resurrection of reason. Now, when we talk about the cultural and social changes, how this cultural and social changes affect or influence philosophical thinking, these aspects, colonial and post-colonial developments, have a major role to play, because after the post-colonial age, philosophy has definitely changed its import from the traditional period and even the modern age. The changing assumptions again, the two world wars, again a major political, socio-political event that has really shaken the Western civilization like anything. So, these two world wars have influenced philosophers and the way they do philosophy. For example, one of the major philosophical trends which we are going to cover in this series, existentialism, is in one sense a result of the Second World War. The agonies, the pains Europeans had to suffer due to the Second World War got expression in the thoughts of philosophers like many philosophers including Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, etc. Then now when we come to 20th century developments, the major development that has taken place in 20th century is the linguistic turn. We call linguistic turn, because in traditional philosophy the emphasis was on, as we have already seen, the Greek thinkers have emphasized more on reality, questions pertaining to, questions related to the nature of reality, the real, whether reality is material or spiritual, questions like that. So, mostly metaphysical questions were raised, and again some questions about the nature of knowledge, foundation of knowledge, etc. The most important development, rather we can call it as a paradigm shift, probably after 17th century in philosophy has taken place in 20th century, we call it linguistic turn. Philosophers cease to focus on or emphasize on questions on the nature of reality, what is the fundamental reality, all sort of questions, and they started taking language, the conceptual issues related to the use of language, questions like meaning, understanding language, what is truth, what is knowledge, what are the prerequisites of linguistic understanding, etc., etc. Such questions became prominently discussed, important during this period. So, this we characterize as linguistic turn in philosophy. So, this is rather can be considered as one of the major changes that has taken place in the very conceptualization, the very conception of philosophy in the last century. We will now see, try to see the history of Western philosophy from a different perspective. We will be repeating almost the same things, but from a different angle. I call it the three major epochs of philosophy, because one prominent contemporary Western philosopher, Richard Rorty, has described, or while he was analyzing the history of Western philosophy, he has described that the whole history of Western thought can be divided into three epochs, three major epochs. The first one is where metaphysical questions and foundations become prominent issues. This we have already seen during the Greek philosophy, the traditional thinkers, Greek thinkers, starting from Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Plato, Aristotle. All these thinkers have kept metaphysics as the most important discipline. So, metaphysics acquired a status of first philosophy within philosophical contemplations. When we come to the Middle Ages, even this has continued, this trend has continued during the Middle Ages. Then in the modern period we could see a shift in emphasis. Here in the modern period, probably with the philosophy of René Descartes, who is considered as the father of modern philosophy, the shift in emphasis is visible. Here philosophy is more concerned about problems in epistemology. We will see it in a little detail later. Coming to the third major shift or third epoch, philosophy of language, which I have already described some time back, that 20th century, this is one of the major developments Western philosophy has witnessed. Philosophy has become philosophy of language. So, we can understand the whole history of Western philosophy with the help of, in the light of these three epochs: the metaphysical, emphasis on metaphysical issues, then later emphasis on epistemological issues, and later in 20th century and even now the emphasis is on language philosophy, philosophy of language, where the major aim of philosophy is analyzing language, understanding the conceptual issues which are relevant for language use, things like that. Now, we will see the issue of metaphysical foundation in a little detail. Ancient philosophy, which we have already seen, Greek philosophy and medieval thought, is largely metaphysical in nature. And here metaphysics as a fundamental science, metaphysics is conceived as a fundamental science or as a foundational science. It deals with the basic nature of reality. What is the fundamental stuff of reality? So, such most fundamental questions were raised by philosophers during this period. Philosophy here is considered as a search for all knowledge and wisdom. So, the most basic knowledge and wisdom is what philosophy aims at. So, metaphysical questions or metaphysical issues try to understand, try to address this problem. What is wisdom? What is fundamental, the final knowledge? What is the most objective knowledge? What is the most universal knowledge? Let us see now metaphysics, what the term metaphysics means. Meta in Greek means over or beyond, and it means beyond nature or fundamental nature of all reality. See, what we experience or what we see and hear, what we know through sense experience is something which is not real. There is something which is more real than that. So, metaphysics is trying to really go beyond what is given to us through the sense organs and understand the basic stuff of reality. Here the emphasis is to discover what underlies everything that we experience. And now we come to epistemological basis of philosophy. See, in the modern period during 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, philosophy encountered an identity crisis, a sort of identity crisis, because reality ceased to be the major concern of philosophy, because other sciences like physics, chemistry and biology have developed and they have patented questions related to reality, nature of reality and all that. So, the major concern of philosophy during this age shifted to knowledge, because all sciences, all disciplines, all fundamental disciplines, physics or chemistry or any other natural sciences, deal with knowledge, knowledge about one particular aspect or department of reality. But philosophy as a special discipline has redefined its duty or redefined its major purpose to see what knowledge is. While all other sciences deal with knowledge about the world, philosophy is concerned about knowledge itself. So, here during this period, epistemological problems or problems related to theory of knowledge, what is knowledge, what are the kinds of knowledge, what are the limitations of knowledge, these are major philosophical epistemological questions. These questions gain prominence during this period. Again, philosophy has redefined itself as a foundational discipline, because while all disciplines deal with knowledge, philosophy deals with knowledge as such. So, again the status of philosophy as a foundational discipline is reasserted from a epistemological perspective. So, philosophy remains as a foundational discipline during this age also. But when we come to the later period, 20th century, this status, philosophy, we could see that philosophy is losing this status. We will see that. Philosophy of language. This is a 20th century development, and in 20th century philosophy we could see that Western philosophy is mainly divided into two traditions, which we call the Anglo-Saxon, English speaking philosophers in England, Australia, United States, Canada and all that. Anglo-Saxon philosophers who are widely called as analytical philosophers, because the major concerns of philosophy are analytical, analysis of language, and also the continental philosophy, basically the philosophies that were prominent in continental Europe, particularly in countries like France, Germany, etc. So, even in both the traditions we could see that there is a linguistic turn. So, philosophy of language is a philosophy of 20th century. Here, for example, Wittgenstein again has defined philosophy in his one of his major works, Tractatus Logica Philosophicus, as a critic of language. So, philosophy is redefining its status as a critic of language during 20th century. But with this redefinition, philosophy loses its foundational status. See, the questions are how language is used, what is meaning, etc., and more prominently the linguisticality of our being. Language is considered as part of man's natural history, or a prominent philosopher in the continental tradition, the hermeneutic philosopher Hans Georg Gadamer, he redefines the Aristotelian definition of man as a rational being, as man as a being who uses language, or man as a linguistic being. So, the linguisticality of human nature or human reality is being asserted in 20th century in both the traditions, analytical philosophy as well as continental philosophy. So, the very being of man is situated in language. This is the trend in the contemporary philosophy in the Western world. We will have a look at contemporary philosophy, because when we say contemporary philosophy, we include the philosophies of 20th century, which include phenomenology, existentialism, hermeneutics, philosophy of language, ordinary language philosophy, and all that. So, we will have a look at contemporary philosophy briefly now. Here we could see that many traditional philosophical ideals are questioned, that philosophy rather challenges most of the assumptions of modernity. Modernity, with the birth of modernity, or rather we can say that modernity idealized rationality, human reason, and the basic assumption of modernity is that reason can solve almost all problems, and reason is so powerful. So, these assumptions were challenged in contemporary philosophy, and we could see that the postmodern temperament in contemporary Western thought even challenges almost all the major traditional philosophical concepts, or the status of traditional philosophical concepts like reason or rationality, truth, knowledge, objectivity, etc. So, philosophy is again undergoing a major shift of emphasis in the contemporary period. We could see that the contemporary philosophy, we can see the influences of various philosophical traditions and philosophers, including ranging from phenomenology of Brentano and Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, existentialism of Heidegger, Sartre, and Jaspers, and many other thinkers. Then philosophy of language of Wittgenstein, Bertrand Russell, and contemporary philosophers like Donald Davidson, W.V. Quine, Putnam. All these philosophers have redefined the nature of philosophy once again. Now, we are going to address one major issue in this lecture series, the philosophy in Germany, because this topic which we are dealing today, phenomenology, has essentially taken its birth in Germany. So, we have to see the history of German philosophy briefly in order to place phenomenology and existentialism in the context of broader German thought and also in European philosophy. As we know, German philosophy, or Germany, has a very rich philosophical tradition. Most of the modern philosophers are Germans. Philosophers like Kant, Hegel, Karl Marx, Wittgenstein, Gottlob Frege, Friedrich Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, all these thinkers are Germans. So, Germany occupies a major place in the history of Western philosophy. Then again, if you slightly go back to 18th century, we can see that 18th century was so crucial in the history of German philosophy. It was the age of enlightenment, where the call for the independence of reason, we have briefly described this issue, but 18th century onwards there is a major shift in the history of German philosophy. And again, Immanuel Kant we cannot have a discussion on German philosophy without mentioning the name of Immanuel Kant, who is one of the path breaking figures in the entire history of Western thought. Kant is often considered as a junction where the whole of traditional philosophy converges to Kant, and again from there it takes or it goes to different directions. So, Kant is a major figure in Western philosophy and in German philosophy as well. We could see that this is one major issue, the holism in German thought, that German thought has a tendency to combine various approaches like empirism and rationalism, realism and idealism. All these tendencies we can see in the philosophy of Kant. And when we come to Hegel, the project is a rational reconstruction of reality, that the whole of reality is being addressed, and Hegel's philosophy particularly tried to understand the whole of reality as a rational project. So, there is we could I mean a holism is visible in German thought, which is not that prominent in other traditions of philosophy in the Western world, especially in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. And again we cannot but mention the name of Karl Marx when we discuss when we have a discussion on German thought, German philosophy. So, another major important figure is Karl Marx. So, with this we will conclude today's lecture, this episode. In this episode we have covered, we were trying to place or we are preparing a conceptual space for phenomenology in the whole history of Western philosophy, so that we can understand its purport, its nature well. So, we have seen some basic characteristic features of Western philosophy, particularly some questions which are prominently raised by Western philosophy in the ancient times. We have seen the major three epochs of Western philosophy, covering the metaphysical epoch, the epistemological period, and philosophy of language in the contemporary period. And then we were trying to see the importance of German philosophy or the role of German philosophy in Western thought, and we could see that there are many prominent thinkers are Germans. Students can try to answer a number of questions like, what is philosophy? Can we define philosophy? Then another question is, what are the three major epochs of philosophy according to Richard Rorty? And another question, what is metaphysics, or what is the importance of metaphysical questions in philosophy? Then what is linguistic turn? With this we will wind up today's episode. Thank you.